Hello and welcome to the Beacon of Hope podcast. This is Pastor Manny, and today I want to bring you a little segment I'm calling Pastor's Ponderings. I'm going to give you a few seemingly disconnected thoughts that are visiting some thoughts I had just while studying through the book of Proverbs. And again, these are not arranged in a fashion homiletically sound. In other words, to pull your mind and make it easy to follow. I haven't laid it out that way. Just giving some thoughts. If we were sitting here and you were across the desk from me and we were just chatting about some different things in the Bible and things we'd learned, that's kind of the idea here of what I'm doing with this podcast. And so I want to give you some of these. And the first one I want to do is here in Proverbs chapter 27. And looking in verse 23, it says, "Be thou diligent to know the state of thy flocks, and look well to thy herds. For riches are not forever, and doth the crown endure to every generation." And here you have two verses that almost seem disconnected, but the beginning word in verse 24, tells you that they are connected and that it's a continuation of the thought. Verse 23 would be by far the most well-known of these two verses, and it's used a lot of times in teaching business, biblical principles and such for business and that sort of thing. It says, "Be thou diligent to know the state of thy flocks, and look well to thy herds." And the idea of that is knowing what you have, being aware of what it is that you have a stewardship with, and then knowing what condition the things you have are in. In other words, keeping up with it. The issue is dealing with the maintenance and accounting of the flock, knowing well thy flock, but also the issue of decay is addressed. And what that means is in verse 24, it asks the question, "For riches are not forever, and doth the crown endure to every generation?" In other words, this question put out there in verse 24 about riches not enduring forever, and does the crown last for every generation, that's tied back into the verse dealing with being diligent to know the state of your flock in this, that we are not only to have a stewardship presently of what we are taking care of, but we have to understand it has to be maintained because there is decay that comes in. If you have a flock of sheep, you have such things as predators coming in trying to take part of the flock. You can have sheep who can actually get overburdened with their wool, and they can actually roll over and get in a position where they cannot get back up, and they can actually die in that position. You can have troubles with the birthing of lambs that can cost the life of the lamb and the mother. You can have certain flies and pests of that type which can come and not only torment the animals, but actually bring infection and bring disease. You have different parasites that can get into them. You have problems with the hooves that can get in. You have problems with feeding on noxious weeds that can happen. In other words, there's a lot of things that can enter in that can bring illness or bring decay to the flock. And when one sheep becomes ill, sometimes they'll rub against another. And so a problem that starts with one can go throughout the flock. And the teaching here on diligence is this: not only must we be cognizant of what we have, and we don't have to have a lot. Don't think this is just for a business owner. Don't think this truth is just for somebody who has a lot of investments and that sort of thing. I believe what would be considered the poor man, who is barely making it week to week financially, is every bit as accountable for what seemingly little he has as the wealthy man is for the great amount that he has. Because our stewardship is not dependent on the amount over which we have control. Our stewardship is a reflection of our respect towards the one who gave it to us. In other words, stewardship is the issue of stewardship is respect towards our master, and our master being God. So whether God puts in my hand seemingly a little, or whether God allows my hand to have seemingly a lot, the issue is the respect I have towards him by how I handle whatever it is I have. And so decay comes in, and part of stewardship is guarding against decay. Here's another thing here. That thought is one. And then Proverbs 28 caught my attention. And Proverbs chapter 28 It says in verse 2, it says, "For the transgression of a land, many are the princes thereof, but by a man of understanding and knowledge, the state thereof shall be prolonged." Here's the only thought I had with that. I said one man, the right kind of man, and you understand, could be a lady also, but one man, the right kind of man, makes a difference. Of course, in Ezekiel 22, verses 23 and through 30, we're taught about that, looking for a man who would make a difference. In James 5, verses 16 through 18, the effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much. We find that God sought for a man to stand in the hedge, to make up the hedge, stand in the gap, make up the hedge. And he couldn't find one. He was looking for a man. And here's my thought. One man, the right kind of man, makes a difference. Let me say it this way too. One woman, the right kind of woman, makes a difference. One teenager, the right kind of teenager, makes a difference. One child, the right kind of child, makes a difference. And so there's a thought with that. Then in Proverbs chapter 23, it's just an interesting thing. And of course, you can see what I mean by the fact I've not tried to weave these together as far as thoughts, but just some ponderings here. Proverbs 23 and verse 32 carries a very strong statement in it. It says this in that passage. It says, I will begin in the verse 31 rather. It says, "Look not thou upon the wine when it is red, when it giveth his color in the cup, when it moveth itself aright." By the way, pointing thereto to the fact that it is an intoxicating drink. It is a fermented drink. That's why it has that movement, or as the scripture says so accurately, moveth itself aright in the cup. I read the verse again. "Look not thou upon the wine when it is red, when it giveth his color in the cup, when it moveth itself aright. At the last," not at the beginning, but at the last, "it biteth like a serpent and stingeth like an adder." And the idea of stinging there is to be putting the poison into the system. Now, we have a day and time where among the fashionable and thinking themselves to be open-minded and thinking themselves to be free in grace, free from moral constraint way too often, we have a generation. I'm not talking about an age group. I'm talking about a group of people now living. We have a generation that thinks social drinking is okay. In fact, they push that. And that's one of the earmarks of the division of in their thinking. For those who don't accept it and say, no, the Bible that teaches that you're not even to look on it when it's moving in the cup is the same Bible you say you believe, and you're to avoid it. Other ones say, no, it's okay. It's okay. The real issue is drunkenness. It never has been and isn't. Drunkenness is an issue, but it's not the only issue. But here's the thought with this. It says at the last, the verse says, it biteth like a serpent. In other words, strikes suddenly. Strikes and hits hard. And it stingeth like an adder, being a poisonous snake. Interesting. In snake poison, various different types have different poisons, but there's one of two types of basic poisons, sometimes a mixture. There's a hemotoxin. Some snakes, when they deliver a bite, they deliver a poison that is predominantly hemotoxin. And what the hemotoxin does is it affects the blood. It may affect the blood's ability to clot. It may clot the blood. It may affect the blood vessels and cause a breakdown in them. So there's internal hemorrhaging, usually starting at the point, if it's a strong hemotoxin, at the point of impact where the snake hits or bites or stings, that area will show great discoloration. There'll be what appears to be tremendous bruising, but what it is, the capillaries are breaking. There's a breakdown as that hemotoxin begins to break down the actual vascular structure that carries the blood, as well as affecting the blood itself. The second type of poison that a snake carries, and some carry both, is a neurotoxin. The neurotoxin, as you would expect by the name, attacks the neurological system, attacks the nerves. And usually the cause of death when a neurotoxin goes in is either violent seizure because of the reaction to the neurological reaction to the presence of the toxin, or diaphragmatic shutdown. There'll be a paralysis that will come to the area of the diaphragm and such, and then, of course, without the diaphragm working and the nerves not conducting their impulses properly through there, if the diaphragm quits working, of course, then the lungs cannot fill and they cannot expel the carbon dioxide, and you basically suffocate. And the Bible says that the booze, at the last, it delivers a poisonous bite. It's interesting. It affects your blood. It literally does. It's amazing the physiological changes of a person's blood work with exposure to alcohol consumption. Sometimes people consume alcohol and then they don't consume it for a while and their blood will go back to a healthy state, but prolonged or repeated use causes damage to the endocrine system. The liver takes a big hit on it because it's a filter and it's trying to filter that poison out of the body. And pretty soon that system starts breaking down. And when the liver is affected, of course, we're familiar with cirrhosis of the liver, where the liver becomes hardened and swollen and that sort of thing. But as the liver starts being affected, the toxins are not brought out of the blood properly, and the entire structure of the blood system begins to change. And as it changes, the more it changes, the more it changes. In other words, you end up with a cascade of events. It starts small, but it picks up speed. And if you can think of it as a pathological avalanche, it picks up speed where more and more things are involved and more problems come. Why? Because that poison's gotten into the system. And then, of course, as a neurotoxin, it literally changes the physiological structure of the brain because of what it does to what's delivered to the brain and how the brain takes in its nutrients. The frontal lobes are affected by it, which affects the reasoning and such. The prolonged use, the entire mental capacity of a person is affected by it. For it stings at the sting of an adder. Amazing thought what people will put into their body. And then last one on these ponderings, as you can see, of different things. In Proverbs chapter 17, it's an interesting verse. And this one's the briefest of these, but it's no less rich for its brevity. In Proverbs 17, verse 24, it says, a man that hath friends must show, I'm reading 1824. Let me go ahead and give that one to you. I accidentally read that. I jumped a chapter. It says, a man that hath friends must show himself friendly, and there's a friend that sticketh closer than a brother. And let me just give this to you. It wasn't part of what I planned, but a lot of people, when I took a survey within our church, I said, tell me about that verse. And I'd quote it to people or let them read it. Tell me what it's teaching. And they would say, well, if you want to have friends, you're going to have to be friendly. You have to be a friendly person to get friends. Almost everybody, until I started teaching on this in our church, answered it as a way of acquiring friends. It is not at all what that verse says. The verse says, a man that hath friends. Present tense, you already possess those friends, must show himself friendly. That verse is not about the acquisition of friends. It's about the maintenance of friendship and the responsibility that if we have friends, then we need to treat them actually as friends. Now, to the verse I was trying to go to, and when that came along, in Proverbs 17, verse 24, it says, wisdom is before him that hath understanding, but the eyes of a fool are in the ends of the earth. Wisdom is before him that hath understanding. It's right there with him. But the eyes of a fool are in the ends of the earth. I sat and pondered on that and thought, okay, Lord, what's that talking about? And you can always tell when you're getting a good biblical answer to something because it matches the entire body and context of the Bible, and it's simple. It fits in. And here's the simple thought with that. Fools are always looking way off instead of tending to what's right at hand. That's what that verse is teaching. A fool, which by the way is a very bad thing to be called by the Bible, a fool is always looking way off what they're going to do next week and what they're going to do at their next chance and how they're going to do the next thing. They're always looking way off instead of tending to what is at hand. Well, their next opportunity, they're going to do right, but they don't take care of what they have right now. That's the mark of a fool. And so these are just some ponderings. I hope that you'll take time, maybe replay this. There's more than what you'll get in one quick listening. And I hope that you'll be blessed and be helped, and maybe be convicted if need be, by what you've heard. Have a great day, and may the Lord bless you.